Hi, welcome to another Retronaut video. And this is another video in the series looking at my own tech history. And in this video, we're going to look at the Quadra 700. So in my last video, we looked at the period from 1991 onwards. This was the period when I owned an Amiga 1500. Now we're going to take a look at the period from 1992 to 93. And we're going to look at the other computer that I used at that time, and that was actually in college. So in 1992, I was on the second year of my graphic design degree course. And at this point in the course, we had completed a pretty solid year of intense projects. Each of these projects was 1 to 3 days in length, and these hammered into us the basic principles of graphic design. Very little of this work involved complex layouts at this point. It was more of a case of learning the basics of typography, color theory, illustration, and so on. Towards the end of that year, we did actually do a pretty intense course on photography as well. And that was really cool because it was taught by commercial photographers. I believe they were industrial photographers, the kind of people that will take photographs of cars and food and things like that. So they certainly knew their stuff. Now, in the second year, we were being given much more lengthy projects. And this is where we were expected to produce more complex works. Now we were expected to produce designs to a brief, and these would combine typography, illustrations, photographs, all of the basic building blocks of graphic design that we'd been learning in the previous year. And then these projects, we knew that they would actually potentially feature in our degree show. It just depended on the quality of the output that we produced in these projects. So these were becoming pretty critical to our final mark. We had to either make our designs by hand in the traditional way, you know, pasting paper onto paper, pasting printed out typography if we were lucky, and images and so on to basically make a proof. Or we could use the more modern technique of using computer design apps, which were becoming more the norm at this point in the early 90s. But there was one area where this whole new digital technology kind of fell down, and at least that's when you were a student anyway, because most of us on this course, we were from working class families, and that meant that very few of us, were swimming in money. But we had to somehow produce prints, and ideally good quality color prints of our work, and this was where the Macintosh Quadra 700 came in. So, to be very clear, I didn't actually own this machine. And to be honest, at the time, I had no hope of owning one, as they were very, very expensive. From what I understand, the base model at the time cost $5,700, and adjusted for prices in 2023, this was about $12,300. So my college just had the one Quadra, and it was a 700, as I said. And because it was so capable, it was always in demand by those who were willing and able to use it. And I was certainly one of those. The reason why it was in demand was because this was a 68040 based machine. So the 4 of the 68040 was where the new model got its name from. It's based on the Latin word quadri, which basically means 4, which you might recognize from words like quadrilateral and so on. The new 68040 was something of a leap ahead in the 68,000 line of processors. It offered about 20 times the speed of the original 68,000. And it was also twice as fast as the previous 68030 CPU. So it was definitely a fast processor. You can think of it like this. The 68040 was pretty much the equivalent of a 486 CPU of that era. But in the Quadra, it was surrounded by Apple's so much more capable and professional System 7 OS, and also the software ecosystem that existed within that OS. The base Quadra came with about 4 megabytes of RAM, but it had a maximum RAM size of 76 megabytes, which at that time was absolutely enormous. As I recall, I think my Quadra, sorry, not my Quadra, I think the college's Quadra, yeah, I used it so much I did tend to think of it as mine. It had about 24 megabytes of RAM, or I believe 32. I can't remember. It was a very long time ago. I definitely remember it was over 20 megabytes. And this was way more RAM than any other machine in the lab. And for the time, like I said, that was just a huge amount of memory. To give you an example, at home, my upgraded Amiga 1500 had a 68030, so it was about half the speed of the Quadra. And I believe it had about 4 megabytes of RAM. I might have had more, but I think it was 4. Until I actually encountered the Quadra, I thought that was pretty roomy for a machine in terms of RAM. RAM, as ever, back in those days was a limiting factor, as it was still very, very expensive. These days, it's not really so much of an issue anymore. Most people can buy a PC or a Mac with a decent amount of memory. But back in those days, machines were definitely hampered by the lack of RAM in them. The Quadra 700 was capable also of 24-bit graphics. Its logic board supports a SIM, and you can replace the SIM in that slot if you wanted to upgrade the graphics capability of that machine, which would give it basically higher bit depths, i.e. 24-bit color. Our college had done this, as our Quadra was definitely 24-bit, I recall that. And at that time, that was pretty exotic. I remember moving to 24-bit graphics was a sea change. It was definitely a sea change in at least home or professional microcomputing. To be clear, the technology, 24-bit graphics, had existed since the 80s, but it was the reserve of very high-end systems, only really used in TV stations and maybe in movies. I'm talking about things like the Quantel Paintbox. I remember how liberating it felt for the first time being able to work with what was effectively an unlimited color palette. As 24-bit uses RGB color space, now colors were much more fluid to use. Remember, until this point, most micros still used a fixed palette of 256 colors per image. To create smooth color blends within that limit of 256 colors, a technique called dithering was used. And this was similar to the pointillist style of painting, which was championed by the French artist Georges Seurat back in the 19th century. He used dots of color to create smooth blends in color. And that's exactly the way that graphics were done, at least to a high standard in those days when you only had 256 colors. It's fair to say, I would say, that it's a combination of limited pixel resolutions, very limited color palettes as we had back then, and the use of dithering to counteract the lack of colors that kind of defines the 8-bit pixel art style that we now look back on nostalgically. With 24-bit graphics, that simply was not needed anymore. You had enough colors that you could create smooth blends, and gradients in particular now look wonderful, whereas before they were very speckly because of the dithering to try and create the illusion of more colors. It was possible to add a 24-bit graphics card to an Amiga, like the A2000, my A1500 back in the day, or the A3000, which I think was released at this point. Graphics cards like the Picasso or similar gave you 24-bit color combined with higher resolutions on the Amiga. But these cards cost thousands of pounds and had to be combined with larger and more expensive monitors to basically handle the higher resolutions and color depths. So that was basically out of my reach. I couldn't afford to get either of those things really. So the reason why this Quadra had 32 meg of RAM and also 24-bit graphics was so it could run an application called Photoshop. Adobe just released this new application and it was actually version 1.0. For the day, Photoshop required a lot of RAM to hold images. Well, images that were useful anyway, the kind of images that you would be happy to print. At the start of my second year in college, the faculty invested in a new Canon photocopier as well. Now, all a photocopier is, they're not that common these days because mostly we tend to use digital media a lot. Some people still have to print things and make photocopies, so I'm sure they're still out there. A photocopier is basically a scanner, and that scanner is then directly connected to a printer. It has some software to combine those two internal devices, and then you've got some external buttons to allow you to control it all. But at the heart of it, it's a scanner and a printer. And this new model from Canon had a new innovation because you could actually just load bitmaps directly from floppy disk and other media. And it could also, I think, transmit those images over the network if you had it connected. And then you could print those images directly in full color from the printer. Now, this may not sound very high tech today, of course, because pretty much all of us have a photo printer at home if we need one. But back then, this was a massive game changer. You have to remember that back then, the bulk of graphic design work was still intended for print, for use in magazines, posters, box art, and so on. Also, I guess food packaging, cans, and whatever. Suddenly, designs could be printed in full color without first making expensive printing separation plates. These were made out of metal and involved etching them with acid to actually make I think it was 4 colors, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, to make a full color print. And that was very, very expensive. And the only reason why you would ever go through that process was to make a long print run, thousands of items. But the problem was, in college, we didn't need that. We just needed to make 1 or 2 test prints. That was it. So this combination of the Quadra 700 and the Canon photocopier allowed us to leap ahead into a new world where we could actually, print things out without worrying about it. You've got to realize that as students, we never did production prints. Everything we did was just a test as we were learning design. So yeah, like I said, this new combination of the Quadra 700 and the printer just made easy mock-ups, high quality mocks obtainable for the first time. And this new fully digital workflow now got us 80% of the way to production print quality and at a price we could afford. Well, we could just about afford it anyway. It wasn't cheap. We still had to do our initial test prints on a black and white laser printer to get the basic layout done. But once we were happy with the project, we could go and take it to the Canon and get it printed out and have a finished print quality. So the Quadra 700 had Apple's System 7 OS installed on it. And this was a direct descendant of the original Mac OS. Well, not the Mac OS that we know these days, but the original OS that was on the Apple Macintosh release in 1984, I should explain. And at this point, as I remember it, it was pretty much the slickest OS you could get for a micro, at least a micro that was affordable by an average human being. It had a mature set of features, including strong support for fonts, and its print support was very comprehensive and robust. Both of those, of course, being very critical for the graphic design market. It was just a whole different experience to using an IBM PC of this era. And I know this as the college had just one IBM PC, at least in our graphics computer lab, and it ran Windows 3.1. I can recall how it looked very rudimentary when compared to System 7, and also, to be fair, to Amiga OS. It just looked like a toy, to be honest. That PC was a lot cheaper, though, so that was its main killer point. It had a 24-bit graphics card. It also had a 486 processor, so it ran at pretty much the same speed as the Quadra in terms of raw processing, and it had 24-bit color. It was just let down by Windows, which was, as I said, something of a toy at this point. When the Quadra was in use in the other room, I would slink off to the other room across the corridor. I would slum it out on the 486 PC using Photoshop on there. PCs were becoming great gaming machines in that era, but Apple still was way ahead in terms of its technology, at least if you ask me. So let's take a look at my own Quadra from that era. It's not actually a 700, it's its larger brother, the Quadra 950, but it is actually from pretty much the same kind of era. And to be fair, I couldn't find a Quadra 700. This came on the market and it was available and it was in good condition. So I jumped at the chance to have my own Quadra all these years later. So let's have a look at the front of this machine and see what we have going on here. So this is the Quadra 950. It's a beast, isn't it? It's a tower design, and it has a pretty monolithic appearance. I really like the industrial design on this machine. Very clean. Still looks quite modern today, I think, actually. And let's look in there a little bit closer. We have 2 drive bays at the front. At the top, we have the floppy drive there. I don't think this is removable. This is pretty much a fixed item in the machine. But below it, we have a 5 1/4 inch bay where you could mount an old 5 1/4 inch floppy drive, but that would be a bit weird at this point. You'd be much more likely to be putting in a CD-ROM drive or possibly maybe a tape drive. We have a key here, which we'll come to in a minute. It's a very interesting feature on this machine. And below that, we have 2 buttons. The top button, I believe, is a reset button. And I think when you press it, it puts the machine into a special machine code monitor or something like that, which allows you to do development work. And then below it, we have a power button. Obviously, to the right, we have the traditional Apple rainbow logo. And below that, we've got the legend. So that key, what does it do? When the machine is in this position, when the key is in this position, I should say, the machine is effectively locked. It can't be turned on. You press the power button and it's not going to do anything. It's not going to turn on. When the machine is in the 1 position, it can be turned on. And in fact, once it's in that position, if you take the key out, the machine can't be turned off. It's locked. However, the keyboard and the mouse are still actually active. So if anybody comes into the room and they want to be a bit naughty, they can actually cause issues. So you then have the 3rd position locked on. When it's in this position, the machine will stay on. Even if you press this button, it will not turn off. And if there is a loss of power, the machine will automatically power cycle and actually boot up again. Also in this mode, indicated by the lock icon, the keyboard and the mouse both do nothing. So that's an interesting feature. It should be pointed out that this machine is actually intended for dual purpose. It was intended as a server and as a graphical workstation. And that might seem like a bit of a weird combination, at least in the modern era, because these days servers tend to be very specifically built. They don't have certain features. But what you've got to think about this machine is, what does a server need? It needs a lot of RAM. What else does it need? It needs a lot of storage. And if you're going to do photographic manipulation for the day, photographs needed a lot of storage and they needed a lot of RAM. So I'm assuming that what happened at Apple was they were designing this server, and I'm not sure which way was first. I think because of the form factor, I think this was a server primarily. And I think the 700, the smaller version of this machine, was intended more for graphics, Photoshop, and so on. This particular machine, I think, is aimed more at the server market, but it does have a dual purpose because it has 24-bit graphics, which, when you think about it, it's not really very useful for a server, but it is very, very useful as a graphic workstation. So yeah, bit of a dual purpose there. So the key, I think, is more to do with its use as a server. You do not want somebody going into a room and turning off the server. And you don't want somebody fiddling around on the keyboard and typing in naughty things and shutting down the software. So yeah, Quadra 950, bit of a split personality machine in that it was a server graphical workstation machine. I should point something out. The keyboards of this era of Macintosh, they have a really cool feature. I remember really liking this at the time, and that is the button that you see on the keyboard there. To turn on the machine, all you have to do is press this button and the machine will actually start up. It has its own type of serial connection. I think it's called ADP. I'll just zoom in here and I'll show you the logo for that. Hopefully you can see that logo there. And this keyboard has 2 ADP ports. It has it there and it has it at the other end. And you can see the mouse is plugged into the keyboard and it's daisy chaining through the other connection into the back of the computer. Now, I've seen another video where somebody was talking about an Apple monitor from this era and how it was a bad design choice that the monitor didn't turn on when you press the on button. Well, it turns out that it's actually part of Apple's design philosophy from that era. And the idea was that the monitor would turn on when you press that button on the keyboard. So in fact, he thought it was a bad design that it didn't turn on, but in fact, it was very fancy and advanced design. The idea was that you would trot up in the morning and start working by pressing the one button, and that would turn on the machine and the monitor at the same time. And conversely, at the end of the day, you would go up to a menu in the Mac and turn it off there. That would turn off the machine with software, which was again pretty fancy. You didn't use the power button. And at the same time, it would also turn off the monitor. And if you think about it, that's a much more civilized way of turning off a machine because it allows the operating system to save any data to disk and so on and so forth, to do any cleaning up before it shuts down. And that's actually the way we shut down machines these days. We don't shut off Windows or we don't shut off Mac OS by just turning the machine off. We actually turn it off by going to a menu and choosing for it to shut down, and it actually has a managed shutdown. So in fact, you know, again, the Mac and the Quadra was kind of ahead of its time. And yeah, boy, did you pay for it. They were expensive machines. That was the only problem really, I suppose. Apple's always been quite elitist in that way. But at the same time, I've always had this kind of dilemma. Is it good that you have a manufacturer out there that charges a lot of money for its hardware? I've come to the conclusion, yes, it is, because otherwise nobody is making a good machine and nobody is pushing the state of the art. So those machines may only be affordable by the elite in the short term, but in the long term, the innovations that you get from those amazing machines filter down to everybody eventually. It's quite similar to what you see in Formula One. Formula One over the years has invented so many things like seat belts and ABS and so on and so forth, using carbon fiber to make cars. And those technologies, they filter down to us mere mortals eventually. So yeah, not good at the time because you think, well, why can't I afford this amazing machine? But at the end of the day, we are all now using computers like this. So yeah, it does work out in the end. Anyway, enough babbling. Let's have a look at the back of the machine and see what we've got going on there. So again, we've got the Quadra legend at the back of the machine. Yep, Macintosh Quadra 950, Apple computers, made in Ireland. If we pull down a bit, this is actually a vent for hot air coming out of the top of the machine. The main vent of hot air is actually here. This is where the power supply is. And when we have a look inside the machine, you'll see what an absolutely gigantic beast that is. And it has a ridiculously huge fan on it as well. Funnily enough, none of the chips have any ventilation on them, but the CPU has a gigantic fan on it. This was a server, the 950. So it's designed to, support a lot of different hardware inside it. And I guess Apple decided that they didn't want those devices, running out of power. Okay, so let's have a look what we've got in terms of connectivity. At the top here, we have the monitor connection. And of course, being Apple, it's a proprietary connection from what I remember. Underneath that, I think you have I think it's an Ethernet connection. I'm not quite sure what type of connection that is. I'll do a little bit of research and try and find out what that is. And we'll get it up on screen. But yeah, very nice that it has a network connection built in. Below that, you have the media connection of the day, which was one of the really nice things about Macintoshes back in that era, was that they had SCSI. So SCSI came from the designer, rather the guy who left IBM and actually popularized floppy disk drives, Shurgard. He produced a system called SASE, I think it was, and it was eventually used and extended upon to make and sort of generalized, and it became very popular as a storage bus. One of the really nice things about it was that it supported multiple devices. I think it was 8. And the other thing that was really cool about it was it had its own processor. And that meant that the CPU of the machine didn't actually have to handle the transfer of data off these devices. It was all managed by the SCSI bus. As I mentioned, SASE was the original name, but it got renamed to SCSI when it became disassociated, I think, with its original inventor. So, oh yeah, by the way, you can, like I said, you can then, use this to attach various SCSI devices, scanners, and I'm not sure about printers, but I think scanners, network cards. You can connect, obviously, hard disks to this. And inside the machine, it has an internal SCSI connector. And this machine is, basically SCSI based. So yeah, it was the superior technology, better than the IDE technology they had on the PC, which was all basically driven by the. Then we've got the power in. And I think, is that the power in? Yes, that's right. I think that's the power in, AC in. And then you can see you've got AC out. So that may seem weird by today's standards, but in this era, it's quite common for a PC, Macintoshes included, to actually have a power cable coming out, and that would then plug into the monitor so that you didn't have to have a separate plug just for the monitor. All of the power was driven by the PC. This was kind of possible in this era because PCs didn't use that much power. Monitors did. So the bulk of the power probably went into the power supply and then came back out and went into the monitor. Maybe that's one of the reasons why it's got such a chonking power supply in there. Maybe, for the extra power for the monitor as well. Okay, now we've got a, this would be, let me see, a serial connection, I suppose, well, it indicates a modem here. So don't forget, in this era, the internet didn't exist really, not for the average user, and you would connect to the internet, even if you did, using a phone. And yeah, what that would do is a modem was basically a device that would convert your digital signal into an analog signal that was then sent on the phone. And at the other end of the phone line, the opposite would happen. And that was how computers communicated with each other. Modem, I think, means, what is it? Modulation and demodulation. Yeah, the process of converting the digital signal into analog. So that's actually literally what it means, modem. Underneath that connector, we've got a printer connector. I'm assuming that that might be possibly parallel because at this time it was still a thing to have parallel connections to printers, so you could send more data in any one puff of data. And Macs were very much associated with printers and printing technology at this time. They were much better at it than PCs, basically, because they had this really good operating system, System 7, which had all the printer drivers built into it. Then we've got an ADP port, and I'll tell you what, it's quite disappointing actually on this machine. The only thing they've really cheaped out on is ADP connections. Maybe it's because ADP can chain, but I guess if you've just terminated your chain, which we have here, with a keyboard and then a mouse plugged into that, yeah, what are you going to plug any other ADP devices into? Because that's it, you've only got one. Interesting. Underneath that, we've got a phono for sound, and it looks like it's the right channel. And we've got another phono for sound underneath. I'm assuming that's the left channel. Then we have a DIN connector. Is it DIN? No, what are they called? Basically a microphone connector, old-fashioned styly. Something which Apple issued recently on their iPhone, and everybody hated it because, let's face it, why would you use a standard connector for a microphone that had been around for 40 years when you could use a Thunderbolt connector to force people to buy Apple dongles? Anyway, rant over about that. And then at the bottom, you've got another connector which uses the same connection type. And again, it's for audio. So in this case, I'm assuming that it's going to send out the stereo signal just using the one jack. Yeah, phono jack. So, and then to the left, you've got the blanking plates for the devices that were plugged into this machine. When I received it, as you can see here, 3 of the blanking plates were missing. So I have to assume that this had 3 cards in it at some point. And then at some point before it was sold to me, those cards were removed. So unfortunately, I don't have either those cards or the blanking plates that would go there. So yeah, relatively standard, really, sort of back on this machine. Things might look a little bit exotic, slightly different connectors, but yeah, I mean, these days it's not normal to have the equivalent of a hard drive connection on the back of the machine, but it certainly is normal to have an Ethernet connection and definitely a HDMI connection. And then, down here, you've got your modem, which has gone with the wind. We don't have those anymore. Printer connection, that would be a USB these days. Actually, this would be a USB. And then the ADP would be a USB as well. So you can think of these as slight variations of what we know as USB, because that's become ubiquitous and is basically used for everything these days. Yeah, and then you've got the 2 power connections, power going in and power coming out. That's a little bit exotic these days, but it's nothing too crazy. Okay, let's get the machine on its side next, and let's have a look inside and see what's going on inside this beast. So this is the Quadra 950 laid bare. It's a pretty massive case. It's a tower case. And inside, probably the biggest thing that takes up the space in the case is the power supply. It really is a beast, isn't it? It's taking up about 30% of the space, I think. And when I renovated this machine, which actually didn't really involve much work because it was in very good condition when I received it, luckily, the power supply was the main thing that I worked on. I took out the power supply. Those plastic handles that you can see there are literally to hold it because it's that heavy. And what I did was I replaced the fan that you can see there with a Noctua fan. That's actually a new fan. The original fan was roughly the same size, black, obviously very old, older technology, and extremely noisy when it was running. So it made a lot of sense to actually replace it with a more modern fan like a Noctua. The other advantage, of course, is the airflow was improved. It's a gigantic power supply, so I have to assume that it gets pretty hot inside. I'm assuming that there's very large capacitors. And I think obviously Apple, when they built this machine, assumed that people would have a lot of different hard disks installed. And they do actually take quite a lot of power to spin the metal disks inside a traditional hard disk. And on top of that, it has 5 slots for graphics cards and so on and so forth, different expansions. So yeah, I think the power supply, I would assume, would handle pretty much anything you could throw at it at that size. In the layout of the machine, you've got the memory slots on the left-hand side. You've got the VRAM actually behind the power supply, which is very odd design. I'm assuming Apple put it there because there just wasn't any space for it anywhere else. There are an awful lot of SIM slots for the main memory, so I assume they put it there because, yeah, there wasn't anywhere else to put it. And I suppose you're only going to upgrade the VRAM very infrequently, so that was probably a choice that they made. At the top of the machine, you've got 2 external drive bays. One which is a 5 1/4 drive bay, which is the sort of traditional drive bay that you would have in an old PC, where you'd have a 5 1/4 floppy, and at the top you've got a bay where a 3.5 device can live. In this machine, that's a floppy disk drive, which at the time was still a useful thing. And underneath it, you've got the space for the 5 1/4 drive, which you can see in this machine is unpopulated. That, you may be wondering what that is there. Well, that's actually a number that you can change. And I think what that is to indicate which SCSI device this was. I'm assuming that Apple assumed that you would put a SCSI CD-ROM drive in here. That's obviously something I'm going to have to look out for. It would be quite nice if I could actually get that and put this in this machine. But I must say, I really wouldn't want to damage the front face of the machine. So if I do get one, it'll have to come with the actual bay that fits on this. And I think that's a bit of a tall order. But yeah, that's what that's for. That's it doesn't actually do anything as far as I know, unless maybe Apple CD-ROM drives were fancy and you could press that button to change which device it was. The hard disks, well, they would have lived here. And I have to assume that there was a caddy here. There was probably some kind of construction that went here that allowed you to put the hard disks up here. Unfortunately, that didn't seem to come with a machine. Not really a big issue because these days I'm not really going to use a physical hard drive anymore. They tend to be unreliable. They're also noisy and hot, and they use more power, and they don't survive very well to the modern day. So I'm using a modern solution, which we'll look at a little bit later. Let's have a look at the RAM. So this is really cool. This machine has 4 banks of SIM slots, A, B, C, and D. And I think right now it's got bank A installed. Not quite sure about that. It looks like it's 2 slots on either side. So yeah, 4 slots per bank. It's an absolute beast, isn't it? I mean, that's just a ridiculous amount of memory. It looks like you have to populate those slots symmetrically. As you can see here, we've got 8 slots filled at the moment out of the full 16. I don't recall what that gives me in this machine. I'll have to check it out at some point. But I remember it's quite a lot of RAM. Oh yeah, that was actually interesting. I watched another channel's video, and it was reviewing this machine. And what I found quite interesting was that the person doing it actually ran Doom, or actually Doom 2 on this machine. And they were stating that I think their machine had 24 megabytes of RAM, and they were worried that that wouldn't be enough RAM to run Doom. Well, as far as I remember, back in 1992, 24 megabytes of RAM was a lot of RAM. That was typical of a sort of very high-end workstation kind of machine. So yeah, that would have easily been enough RAM to run Doom. It's another thing to say that the CPU, the 6840, would have been enough. But yeah, that was already a large amount of memory. And don't forget those slots would allow you to go up to 256 meg of RAM in this machine, which is just an insane amount of memory for the time. Next to the RAM is a battery, and I think it's called a PRAM battery. I guess that's the equivalent of a BIOS on a PC, IBM PC. So I did actually change that battery. I believe there was one in there when I received the machine, but there was no leak damage or anything like that, thank God. But I changed the battery just in case, just to make sure that that didn't happen in the near future. Down here, let me just lower in the camera. I'll have to be careful as I do this. That's the 68040. And yeah, you know, there's the typical sort of heatsink you would have on it. That was the equivalent of a 486 chip back in the 90s. I've seen a lot of people talk about these chips and compare them to 486s unfavorably, but from what I understand, they were actually pretty decent chips and they ran at a pretty high speed. I think later, obviously, the 486 had a number of clock improvements, and I think that's where the Intel chip did actually win out in the end, because it could actually be, you could have the clock speed increase quite a lot and it still ran. Whereas I think the 68040 didn't really go that high. The VRAM, let's have a look at that. So that's actually underneath here. Let's see if we can see this. There it is. There's the VRAM, just underneath the power supply. Hopefully you can see that there. In this machine, it's actually fully populated, which is pretty cool. So hopefully this machine has got the maximum of 2 megabytes of VRAM, and that would give the machine higher resolutions in 24-bit color, but it would also mean that it could do 24-bit color in the first place. If you didn't have enough VRAM in this machine, then you might be limited to 16-bit color, or at worst 8-bit color. But I would probably say, you know, if that is maxed out, then that kind of indicates that this machine was used as a graphics workstation. It could have also had a different life as a server, but yeah, that does kind of indicate that this machine, combined with the amount of RAM it already has in it, was actually used as a graphics workstation. So that's pretty interesting. Right next to the 68040 slot, we've got what's called the PDS slot. PDS stands for Processor Direct Slot. And as far as I understand it, it's very similar to the processor slot in an Amiga 2000. It gives you direct access to the processor bus. And once you have an expansion card plugged in that slot, it will actually take over control of the machine and replace the CPU. So that's really cool. I think there's a PowerPC PDS card that you can get for this machine, which would make it much faster. So maybe, you know, I'll keep an eye out for that in the future. See if I can actually upgrade the machine maybe. I'm not desperate to do that, but that would be interesting. Over to the right of the PDS, you've got the new bus slots, and these are the equivalent of ISA slots in an IBM PC. You know, this is where your expansion cards would plug in. Interesting design, this sort of grid array of, I assume, pins, and I guess that gives it a lot more connections to the card. Interesting design. And then at the back of the machine, you've got the blanking plates, some of which are missing. And then finally, but not least, of course, we've got the storage. This cable that you see here, which is quite unwieldy, actually, that's the SCSI cable. So let me just move out a bit here. And I'm just going to grab that and flop this into view so you can see that a bit more clearly. This is, hopefully you can see that there, this is a SCSI to SD card, version 5.1, as you can see there. This is an alternative to the Zulu SCSI, which has become a lot more popular. I can't remember about the performance on this card, but it's what I had at the time when I actually put this machine together. I believe I configured the OS, I think it's System 7, on an emulator on a Macintosh. I think I used Basilisk. And I created a hard drive image on that machine, got it set up, and then you know, plugged it in here, turned on the machine, and it worked. So that was an amazing moment when this machine sprang to life. What else can I say about this machine? Okay, yeah, so the 68040 in this machine, it's actually running at 33 megahertz, which is, I believe, about 20%. No, I think it's 30% faster than the 25 megahertz 68040 that came in the Quadra 700 and 900. So that's a pretty good speed boost by today's standards. If you think about it, you know, 30% speed improvement in, I think it was just over a year. This came out pretty soon after the Quadra 900, which was basically the equivalent of the Quadra 700, just in a much larger case. So yeah, the Quadra 900 was exactly the same as this case, actually. Obviously, you had a logic board upgrade for the 950. Also, the VRAM that I showed you runs in this machine at 80 nanoseconds rather than 100 nanoseconds. Obviously, the less nanoseconds it takes per cycle, the faster the memory can refresh, and that gives you a direct speed increase to the graphics power of this machine. So I believe that was 20% faster. Yeah, obviously 80 from 100. So that 20% combined with the 30% of the CPU gave you a graphics architecture on this machine, which is about 50% faster than the Quadra 900, which wasn't really a slouch anyway. So yeah, definitely sort of a worthy upgrade from the 900. And you know, this machine was a beast back in the day. I think it cost $7,200, which would have been pretty much the same price in pounds. And in today's money, you're probably talking about £15,000 for this machine. It could be used as a graphics workstation. You know, that memory and that 24-bit graphics architecture made this, you know, perfectly suitable as a graphics powerhouse, you know, for working in Photoshop, where you needed RAM. That was the big problem with Photoshop. It just needed a lot of RAM to be able to store 24-bit files, you know, and especially when they were in high resolution. And, you know, this machine was definitely up to the task. Pretty much, you could think of it as like a sort of low-end silicon graphics machine. Silicon graphics machines were much more expensive than this again. So yeah, if you had a studio and you wanted to do photo manipulation back in 1992, which was when basically Photoshop came out, this was one of the machines that you could do it on. That time was an amazing time because it was part of a graphic revolution where you were moving from doing graphics in an analog way, you know, pieces of paper glued onto other pieces of paper, and now you were moving into fully digital publishing, desktop publishing. And this machine was a fantastic machine to use in college. Well, not this one, but the 700, which was very similar. So yeah, wonderful machine. And I definitely was very much privileged to use one of these back in the day. So the Quadra 700, in my case, 950. What does it represent? Well, for me, it represents a point in time where there was quite a big change in the world and also in my own personal life. So in my personal life, I was going from a situation where I was basically using computers as toys, something to experiment on, you know, something to play games on, maybe do some art, do some explorations in video, maybe 3D, things like that. And now I was kind of looking at computers as a way to make money. This was a potential career. I was training to be a graphic designer. And what that meant was that in the future, I would probably have to use computers to do graphic design. I was on a course, and in the first year of the course, we actually were kept away from computers, funnily enough, because, you know, the guys teaching us, they were all seasoned graphics veterans, people from print backgrounds, people with skills in calligraphy, as I remember it. Some people had worked in advertising. And they'd come from an analog world, you know, a world where you basically made everything out of paper. You did things with photography. You could do, you know, a layout in paper and then maybe photograph it, and that would become a plate that you would actually use in a print and so on. But since the middle of the 1980s, we'd started to move into a new world where you had Aldous PageMaker, you know, desktop publishing. That was a reality at that point. Mainly it was actually, you know, producing prints in black and white. But as I outlined in this video, we were starting to get to the point where we had technology where we could do proofs in full color, which was a major breakthrough, you know, using, as I said, that Canon photocopier in our college was an amazing connection to the Quadra that we had there. So we had the ability to not only design in full color for the first time, you know, 24-bit graphics, but we also had the ability to do those prints. And those, you know, in a full graphics pipeline, those wouldn't have been the end of the world. We would have actually gone probably to actually producing metal plates and doing high quality full color prints, you know, large runs. As it turns out in the future, that isn't actually where I ended up going with my career. But that's what I was being trained for in college. And yeah, they did a good job of it. I really enjoyed that course. It was a fantastic course. And kudos to the tutors there. I think they did a great job of nurturing us in those 3 years. It was really great. The Quadra, what does it represent? Well, funnily enough, it was the last great hurrah for the Motorola 68000 line. Pretty soon after the 950, Apple switched to a set of desktop Quadras, which they initially branded as Centris. I think there were other Centris computers as well. but they realized they'd obviously spent some time setting up this Quadra brand within, the Macintosh brand, and they realized that the Centris brand was going away from that and was confusing people. And this was kind of indicative, really, of Apple at that time. The marketing department and the hardware department just didn't seem to know quite what they were doing. They were producing more and more machines, and at this point, when the Quadra was made, actually, I don't think it was so bad at that point. I think it was basically after about 1993 that things started to go off the rails. They started to produce more and more machines, which had sort of muddy ideas of what they were for, and they started to just basically stand on their own toes too much, and it confused buyers. People didn't really know what Macintosh they could, they really needed to buy. And I think that's why Steve Jobs was so influential when he came back in and just cleared the decks and said, we're going to go back to one or two computers. So it just makes the consumer's life a lot easier. They know exactly what they want to buy. I've seen some other videos on the Quadra range, actually the Centris, and that's quite worrying because I recently watched a video by Adrian's Digital Basement, and in that he recapped a Centris 610, which is a Quadra. And in that video, it had electrolytic capacitors. I think there were about 10 maybe altogether on the board, and they were all leaking, all of them. So that was pretty scary because I have stored away a Centris 650, which is, as I said, a Quadra, and it's from that exact era. So I probably need to dig that out as soon as I can and take a look at the logic board. And if it has got a lot of electrolytics on it, I'm going to have to follow Adrian's lead and remove them and replace them because, yeah, that's going to cause damage to that machine. I don't know if you noticed it during the internal inspection of this machine. I didn't notice any. Maybe it was a cost thing. Maybe electrolytics are used when ceramic capacitors are too expensive. And this was a very expensive machine. So it looks like Apple didn't do that on this machine, which is really good. Having said that, once this video is over, I will actually take the logic board out and have an inspection. You never know, there might be a couple of electrolytic capacitors hiding somewhere underneath that gigantic power supply. So yeah, an interesting period in time in my life, transitioning from, basically a child to an adult and having to learn for the first time how to make money using computers like this. And at the same time, you've got this interesting transition from analog media to digital media. And that was, the story of my teenage years and early adult life. It was this explosion of digital media. And I was part of that, obviously, as a user. I was a part of it to some degree as a creator, which we'll talk about in future videos. So yeah, fantastic machine. Really happy I got to use one of these back in the days. And I'm really happy now that I've got not only this one, but I've got the Centris as well to have a play around with. This machine in particular, I think, warrants definitely more videos where we try and put more memory in it, maybe. Get it up to its, it'd be interesting to get it up to its full spec, wouldn't it? 256 meg. There's also that PDS slot, which is desperate really to have the expansion put in it. The solution that I have in there, the SCSI to SD solution, that's really interesting because with that, it'll be quite easy to actually have different SD cards where I can have an operating system like System 7 or System 8. It would be quite easy to actually put in a PowerPC card and then swap the SD card, and all of a sudden it will be a completely different machine with, the PowerPC processor, which is, yeah, that'd be quite interesting, wouldn't it? The only problem is those cards are expensive, so we'll have to see how it goes with the channel and its support to see if I can afford to actually do that. So yeah, hopefully you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please obviously click on the link button and also subscribe if you can, because that will help the channel to grow. I'm thinking about getting a Patreon channel set up, Patreon account, because this stuff is expensive, and it looks like, YouTube, they don't really pay out that well. And the thing about retro computing is it's something that we're all really passionate about, us in the community, but the community isn't that large that we get large viewer numbers. So, the cost of producing this video and buying the equipment it's high. So, I'm going to need your support in the future to do that. And we'll see how that goes. You know, that would be really appreciated if we can get the patrons on board. So yeah, hopefully you enjoyed this video, and I'm looking forward to see you in the next one.